What if the world's oldest buildings weren't built by primitive societies at all, but by people far more organised than we're told? What if massive stone monuments appeared before cities, before metal, before writing? Across deserts, islands, jungles and floodplains, structures rise that shouldn't exist when they do. Too precise, too large, too coordinated. Were these temples, homes, cities, or something else entirely? Why do they appear, then vanish? And what does it mean that mainstream archaeology still can't fully explain why they were built? Who were these builders, and what are we still missing? Göbekli Tepe. On a limestone ridge overlooking the Harran Plain of southeastern Anatolia, the site known as Göbekli Tepe emerges quietly from the soil, not as a city or a fortress, but as an arrangement of circles, pillars, and negative space that seems to resist easy categorization, its earliest construction dating to the 10th millennium BCE, a time when the conventional narrative of human history places societies firmly in the realm of mobile hunter-gatherers, with limited architectural ambition. The hill itself, long used by farmers as a convenient rise in the landscape, concealed beneath its surface a sequence of stone enclosures built from finely cut local limestone, each defined by massive T-shaped pillars set into circular walls, some weighing more than 10 tons, their surfaces smoothed and, in places, carved with low-relief images of animals, foxes, boars, aurochs, snakes, birds, rendered with a confidence that implies both technical mastery and symbolic intent. The earliest excavations revealed that these structures were not isolated monuments, but part of a complex architectural program spanning centuries, perhaps millennia, with older enclosures deliberately backfilled and new ones constructed atop them, creating a stratified mound that grew through repeated acts of building use and burial, a process suggesting continuity of purpose rather than a single burst of activity. The absence of domestic features, hearths, storage bins, refuse layers associated with everyday living, initially sharpened the sense that Göbekli Tepe did not function as a village, and yet the labour required to quarry, shape, transport, and erect the pillars implies organised groups capable of sustained cooperation, planning, and knowledge transmission, all achieved without evidence of agriculture, ceramics, or metal tools, relying instead on stone implements and human coordination. The pillars themselves, abstracted into a T form, have been interpreted as stylized human figures, with some bearing carved arms, hands, belts, and loincloths, transforming the architectural supports into presences rather than inert elements, and positioning them in pairs at the centre of each enclosure, facing one another across a space that feels intentionally framed, as if to host gatherings, rituals, or performances whose precise nature remains inaccessible, but whose seriousness is suggested by the scale and care of the construction. Radiocarbon dates anchor the earliest phases to a period before the widespread domestication of plants and animals in the region, raising careful questions about causality rather than overturning chronology outright, as the site appears to coincide with, rather than contradict, the broader Neolithic transition, perhaps indicating that communal building and shared symbolic systems were not consequences of agriculture, but parallel developments that may have encouraged more permanent settlement patterns elsewhere. Geological analysis of the bedrock shows that many of the pillars were quarried directly from the hill itself, leaving behind negative outlines that still match the extracted forms, while microscopic wear patterns on stone tools suggest techniques of percussion and abrasion refined through repeated use, pointing to a learned craft tradition rather than improvisation. Yet, even as the evidence accumulates, contradictions persist. The enclosures are monumental yet ephemeral, built with great effort only to be intentionally filled in with debris composed of stone chips, animal bones, and sediment, an act that sealed the structures almost immediately after their primary use, preserving them but also obscuring their purpose, as though each architectural phase was designed to be temporary, its completion marked not by abandonment but by burial. Faunal remains indicate the consumption of wild game in large quantities, hinting at feasting events that could have drawn dispersed groups together seasonally, while the iconography of dangerous animals, predators and venomous creatures more than prey species, suggests a symbolic landscape oriented toward power, boundary, and perhaps cosmology rather than subsistence alone. The lack of clear residential architecture nearby complicates attempts to identify the builders as sedentary or nomadic, and instead places them in an intermediate zone where mobility, aggregation, and dispersal may have followed rhythms dictated by climate, resource availability, and social obligation rather than fixed settlement. Environmental data from the early Holocene show a landscape undergoing gradual warming and increased precipitation, creating conditions favourable for experimentation with plant management in the surrounding region. And it is within this context that Göbekli Tepe sits not as an anomaly, but as a node. Within a broader cultural network stretching across Upper Mesopotamia, where other, smaller ritual sites echo aspects of its design, though none approach its scale or density. The question of why such effort was invested in non-domestic architecture remains open, and cautious hypotheses suggest that shared ceremonial spaces could have functioned to reinforce group identity, negotiate alliances, and transmit knowledge across generations, particularly in societies lacking formal hierarchies or permanent political structures, making architecture itself a medium of social memory. At the same time, the apparent anthropomorphic quality of the pillars invites interpretations that stop short of assigning named deities or formal religions, instead recognizing a symbolic grammar in which stone bodies, animal forms, and spatial arrangements communicated meanings now largely inaccessible, shaped by worldviews that did not separate the natural and the social as distinctly as later cultures would. As excavations continue, still revealing only a fraction of the site, the initial shock of Göbekli Tepe's age gives way to a quieter recalibration, where the focus shifts from astonishment to integration, from asking how such a place could exist to exploring how it fit within the long, uneven process by which humans began to gather, build, remember, and mark landscapes with intention. The hill does not announce answers so much as it preserves questions in limestone and fill, its buried circles, reminding us that the earliest monumental architecture may not have been built to last forever, but to be completed, closed and transformed, leaving behind a record that feels deliberate yet incomplete, an architectural trace of decisions made at the threshold of settled life, whose full logic remains just beyond the edge of excavation. Tower of Jericho. At the edge of the Jordan Valley, where the land falls away toward one of the lowest elevations on Earth, the mound of Tell Sultan rises subtly above the surrounding plain, its appearance unremarkable until excavation reveals a deep sequence of human presence extending back to the earliest chapters of settled life. And within this accumulation of mud brick, ash and eroded walls stands the Tower of Jericho, a massive stone structure dating to around 8000 BCE, whose quiet persistence has long complicated assumptions about what early Neolithic communities were capable of imagining and executing. Built during the pre-pottery Neolithic A period, the tower is cylindrical, constructed from undressed limestone blocks, carefully stacked to form walls more than 8 meters high and nearly 9 meters in diameter, with an internal stone staircase ascending steeply toward what may once have been an upper platform, its steps worn smooth by feet that climbed them long before pottery, metal, or writing entered the human record. The tower is integrated into a larger stone wall encircling the early settlement, and together they suggest not only permanence but a degree of foresight, planning and communal labour that exceeds the minimal requirements of survival, especially given that Jericho at this time was already benefiting from natural springs that supported agriculture and year-round occupation. Unlike later fortifications, however, the wall and tower do not conform neatly to defensive logic, as their scale and placement raise questions about whom they were meant to repel, if anyone, and whether their primary function lay elsewhere, perhaps in managing floods from seasonal rains, organising social space, or marking a boundary that was as symbolic as it was practical. Archaeological context shows that early Jericho was among the first true villages, with round houses built of mud brick, plastered floors, and evidence of cultivated cereals, situating the tower not in a transient camp, but in a community already experimenting with long-term investment in place. The construction itself implies an organised workforce capable of quarrying and transporting stone, coordinating tasks and sustaining effort over time, all without clear signs of centralised authority, suggesting that shared goals or collective beliefs may have motivated participation more effectively than coercion. As with Göbekli Tepe, the tower's significance deepens rather than resolves with closer study, as its interior staircase, enclosed and steeply inclined, appears less suited to rapid movement than to controlled ascent, perhaps regulating access to a vantage point that held meaning beyond utility. Some researchers have noted that the tower's orientation aligns roughly with the setting sun behind nearby mountains at the summer solstice, a correspondence that remains debated, but introduces the possibility that the structure engaged with the surrounding landscape in deliberate ways, connecting built form, seasonal cycles, and communal experience. Even if such alignments were incidental, the sheer prominence of the tower would have made it a focal point within the village, a vertical interruption in a landscape otherwise defined by low structures and open sky, visible from a distance and persistent across generations. The effort to build upward in stone at such an early date invites reflection on why height mattered, whether as a means of observation, a statement of collective endurance, or a way to anchor memory and identity in material form. Yet the tower's life was not indefinite. Archaeological layers indicate that it was eventually abandoned and partially buried as the settlement evolved, its presence absorbed into the growing mound rather than maintained as an eternal monument. This pattern of construction, followed by concealment, echoes a broader Neolithic tendency towards cycles of building and covering, suggesting that permanence was not always the intended outcome, even when stone was employed. The tower's survival into the present owes less to its builder's desire for longevity than to the slow accumulation of debris and sediment that sealed it away, preserving it as an artifact rather than a functioning structure. Interpretations have ranged cautiously across practical and symbolic possibilities, from flood control to communal defense to ritual or calendrical use, yet none fully account for all aspects of its design, and the lack of written records ensures that certainty remains out of reach. What can be said is that the Tower of Jericho occupies a threshold moment when human groups were renegotiating their relationship with time, labour and landscape, moving from seasonal movement toward rootedness and discovering that architecture could shape not only shelter, but social order and shared meaning. The tower does not announce a city-state or an empire, but it does signal a willingness to invest in something larger than individual households, to coordinate effort around a structure whose benefits, whether practical or symbolic, were collective rather than personal. In this sense, it stands as one of the earliest expressions of monumentality, not as spectacle, but as process, emerging from repeated acts of cooperation rather than a single decisive command. The surrounding wall, often interpreted through the lens of later fortifications, may instead represent an attempt to define community boundaries in a newly settled world, where ownership, territory and belonging were becoming more sharply articulated. The tower, rising from within that boundary, reinforces this reading as an inward-looking structure, oriented toward those who lived alongside it rather than toward outsiders. As excavation techniques refine our understanding of early Jericho's stratigraphy and chronology, the tower continues to resist definitive explanation, its meaning distributed across function, symbol, and social practice rather than confined to any single category. It remains an early reminder that the impulse to build upward, to gather stone into enduring form, did not begin with kings or temples, but with small communities testing the possibilities of permanence, discovering that architecture could hold time, labour, and intention together in ways that outlasted memory, leaving behind structures that still invite careful attention without yielding final answers. Catalhoyuk. Rising gently from the Konya plain of central Anatolia, Catalhoyuk appears at first as an unassuming mound, its twin humps shaped by centuries of wind and cultivation. Yet beneath this surface lies one of the most extensive and intimate records of early settled life, occupied from roughly 7,400 to 6,200 BCE, during a period when communities were still negotiating what it meant to live together in permanence. Unlike the monumental enclosures of Göbekli Tepe, or the singular vertical assertion of the Tower of Jericho, Catalhoyuk presents itself as a dense aggregation of homes pressed tightly together, their mud brick walls shared, their streets absent, and their boundaries defined not by open space but by proximity, creating an architecture that turned inward and upward rather than outward. Entry into each house was made through the roof, by ladder, and movement across the settlement occurred along a continuous rooftop surface, transforming the sky-facing plain into a communal thoroughfare and blurring the distinction between private and public space. Within these compact interiors, daily life unfolded amid plastered walls and floors that were repeatedly resurfaced, sometimes dozens of times, each layer sealing earlier traces beneath it and contributing incrementally to the rising mound that now marks the site. The houses were not uniform shelters, but carefully organized spaces where cooking, sleeping, storage, and ritual activities coexisted within a consistent architectural template, suggesting shared norms rather than rigid enforcement, and reinforcing the impression of a community governed more by tradition and mutual expectation than by centralized authority. Archaeological evidence reveals an economy based on mixed farming and herding, supplemented by hunting, situating Catalhoyuk firmly within the Neolithic world. Yet the material culture within the houses complicates any simple narrative of subsistence-driven settlement. Walls were adorned with paintings depicting animals, abstract patterns, and scenes that resist straightforward interpretation, while sculpted reliefs and installations, often featuring horned animals or human figures, were integrated directly into the architecture, making the house itself a repository of memory and meaning. Beneath the floors, the dead were buried, sometimes accompanied by grave goods, linking ancestry to dwelling, and ensuring that each household accumulated not only material layers, but genealogical depth. Over time, houses were abandoned, filled in, and built over, their successors often replicating the layout of earlier structures, creating vertical sequences of occupation that maintained continuity while allowing gradual change. This practice of rebuilding in place fostered a sense of temporal compression, where past and present coexisted within a few meters of earth, and where the act of construction was inseparable from remembrance. Despite the density of the settlement, there is little evidence of pronounced social stratification. Houses are broadly similar in size and construction, and prestige goods are distributed relatively evenly, suggesting that inequality, if present, was muted or expressed in ways that have left limited archaeological trace. This apparent egalitarianism stands in tension with the richness of symbolic expression, raising questions about how authority, belief, and social cohesion were maintained without monumental architecture or formal public spaces. Instead of temples or plazas, it appears that meaning was localized, embedded in domestic contexts, and negotiated at the scale of the household rather than imposed from above. The absence of streets and the reliance on rooftops for circulation may have reinforced this inward focus, directing attention towards shared surfaces and collective maintenance rather than outward display. Environmental data indicate that the surrounding landscape provided fertile soils and access to resources, yet climatic fluctuations over the centuries required adaptability. And the settlement's longevity suggests that its social organization was resilient enough to absorb stress without fracturing. As excavations progressed, particularly during the late 20th and early 21st centuries, interpretations of Catalhoyuk evolved, moving away from earlier notions of a proto-city with centralized planning toward an appreciation of its emergent order, shaped by repeated decisions at the household level that collectively produced a coherent, long-lasting community. Contradictions remain, however, especially in the interpretation of the site's art and symbolism, which has been variously read as religious, narrative, or mnemonic, with no consensus on whether certain houses functioned as shrines or whether ritual permeated. All domestic space without clear distinction. The famous figurines, once taken as evidence of a dominant mother goddess cult, are now understood within a broader assemblage that includes many forms and materials, cautioning against singular explanations and highlighting the danger of projecting later religious frameworks onto early Neolithic contexts. What emerges instead is a picture of a society deeply invested in continuity, where building, dwelling, and remembering were tightly interwoven, and where architecture served less to impress outsiders than to stabilize relationships among those within. The gradual abandonment of the site around 6200 BCE does not appear to coincide with sudden collapse, but with shifting settlement patterns across the region, as populations dispersed into smaller communities or adopted different forms of organization. In this light, Catalhoyuk can be seen not as a failed experiment, but as a long-running negotiation, one that explored the possibilities and limits of dense communal living before moving on. Its legacy lies not in monumental ruins, but in accumulated flaws, shared walls, and buried lives, offering a counterpoint to narratives that equate early complexity with hierarchy and spectacle. The mound remains a quiet archive of decisions made over generations, preserving a record of how humans learned to live together at scale, balancing individuality and conformity, memory and renewal, in spaces that were at once ordinary and deeply charged, leaving behind a settlement that continues to invite careful attention without yielding a single definitive interpretation. Knossos. On the low hills of northern Crete, a short distance inland from the modern coastline, the remains of Knossos spread outward rather than upward, a complex of courts, corridors, stairways, and rooms that accumulated over centuries and now survives as a palimpsest of stone, plaster, and reconstruction, its earliest foundations reaching back to the late 4th millennium BCE, and its most elaborate phases unfolding during the Middle and Late Bronze Age. Unlike the compact density of Catalhoyuk, or the stark monumentality of earlier Neolithic structures, Knossos announces a different architectural ambition, one rooted in expansion, circulation, and visual display, where movement itself appears to have been a defining feature of the built environment. The so-called palace, though the term carries assumptions inherited from later societies, functioned less as a royal residence in the narrow sense than as a central node within a wider settlement, integrating administrative, economic, ritual, and perhaps political activities into a single, continuously modified complex. Its layout resists simple symmetry, unfolding instead through a sequence of open courts and narrow passages that channel light and air deep into the structure, aided by light wells and multiple stories that created a dynamic interplay of shadow and brightness across interior spaces. The use of ashlar masonry, timber framing, and gypsum floors reveals a sophisticated understanding of materials, while repeated rebuilding after seismic events indicates both the vulnerability of the site and the determination of its inhabitants to maintain continuity in place. The central court anchors the complex spatially and symbolically, serving as a gathering space whose proportions and orientation suggest ritual significance, though the precise nature of those rituals remains indistinct. Around it cluster storerooms lined with massive pithoi, workshops, and rooms adorned with frescoes depicting processions, animals, and landscapes. Imagery that emphasizes movement, vitality, and a close relationship with the natural world rather than overt displays of military power. Administrative artifacts, including clay tablets inscribed in Linear A, attest to systems of record-keeping and redistribution, situating Knossos within a network of exchange that extended across Crete and into the wider Aegean, yet the undeciphered script preserves an element of opacity, reminding us that the social and political structures behind these records are only partially accessible. The absence of fortification walls around Knossos has long been noted, prompting interpretations that emphasize maritime connectivity, control through economic integration, or a cultural preference for openness, though such readings must contend with the realities of conflict and competition in the Bronze Age Mediterranean. Myth has layered additional meaning onto the site, most famously through the story of the Labyrinth and the Minotaur, a narrative that, while composed centuries later, reflects an ancient perception of Knossos as a place of complexity, enclosure, and power. Its architecture capable of inspiring awe and disorientation even in ruin. Modern excavation and reconstruction, particularly under Arthur Evans in the early 20th century, further complicate the picture, as concrete restorations and interpretive choices have shaped contemporary experience of the site, blending evidence with conjecture and raising ongoing debates about authenticity and preservation. Beneath these later layers, however, the archaeological record reveals a long sequence of occupation marked by cycles of destruction and renewal, often linked to earthquakes, fires, or broader regional upheavals, each rebuilding phase adapting earlier layouts while introducing new elements, suggesting an evolving institution rather than a static monument. Social stratification appears more pronounced here than at earlier Neolithic sites, inferred from differential access to resources, specialized production, and the scale of administrative spaces, yet power at Knossos seems to have been exercised through organization and display rather than through overt militarization. The integration of art into architecture, frescoes positioned to guide movement or frame views, indicates an awareness of how built space could shape perception and behavior, reinforcing communal narratives and hierarchies without explicit instruction. Still, contradictions persist, particularly regarding the nature of authority. Whether Knossos was governed by a centralized ruler, a priestly elite, or a more distributed administrative system remains unresolved, in part because the material evidence supports multiple readings, the eventual decline of Knossos around the mid-2nd. Millennium BCE, following destruction events and shifts in regional power, does not erase its influence as architectural ideas and administrative practices continued to circulate in modified forms across the Aegean. In retrospect, Knossos occupies a middle ground in the long history of monumental building, bridging earlier communal constructions and later imperial architectures, demonstrating how complexity could be embedded in spatial experience rather than in sheer mass. Its surviving walls and corridors, filtered through myth and modern intervention, still convey a sense of controlled movement and layered meaning, inviting careful consideration of how architecture can organize society while remaining adaptable to change. Knossos does not resolve the question of how early complex societies governed themselves, but it preserves a record of experimentation, where building became a tool for managing resources, memory, and identity in a connected world, leaving behind a structure that continues to shape interpretation even as its original logic remains partially concealed. Ggantija temples. On the island of Gozo, rising gently above a landscape of terraced fields and dry stone walls, the Ggantija temples occupy a limestone plateau that appears at once ordinary and improbable. Their massive forms emerging from the ground, with a solidity that feels disproportionate to the small island setting, and yet their origins reach back to around 3600 BCE, placing them among the earliest freestanding stone structures in the world. Long before classical civilizations left their written histories around the Mediterranean, communities on Malta and Gozo were already shaping stone on a monumental scale, quarrying and maneuvering blocks that weigh several tons and arranging them into curving, multi-apsed plans whose logic is still only partially understood. The name Ggantija, derived from later folklore meaning place of giants, reflects a much later attempt to explain the apparent mismatch between the size of the stones and the presumed capabilities of their builders. But archaeology replaces myth with a quieter astonishment, grounded in method rather than marvel. The temples consist of two adjoining structures enclosed within a single boundary wall, their facades defined by large upright megaliths that frame narrow entrances leading into a sequence of rounded chambers, each space flowing into the next in a rhythm that feels deliberate and controlled. The stones themselves are of two main types of local limestone: softer globigerina, used for interior surfaces, and harder coralline limestone for exterior walls, a material distinction that suggests an understanding of durability and finish, rather than random selection. Construction techniques relied on stone tools, leverage, and human coordination, with evidence indicating that spherical stones may have been used as rollers to move the largest blocks across prepared ground. The effort required to build Ggantija implies a community willing to invest significant labour in a shared project, sustained over generations, and capable of transmitting architectural knowledge without written plans. Unlike the domestic intimacy of Knap of Hauer or the inward-focused density of Catalhoyuk, Ggantija announces itself as a communal space set apart from daily living, with no evidence of permanent habitation within the temple precincts. Instead, the interior chambers contain altars, niches, and stone features that point toward repeated ceremonial use, while animal bones and libation vessels suggest offerings rather than meals, reinforcing the interpretation of the site as a focal point for ritual activity. Yet even here, interpretation must remain cautious, as the absence of texts leaves meaning to be inferred from spatial arrangement, material remains, and comparison with other Maltese temple sites that share similar layouts. The repetition of the apse, form across multiple temples on Malta, indicates a shared architectural grammar, one that emphasizes enclosure, symmetry, and progression inward, perhaps guiding participants through a sequence of spaces that structured experience as much as belief. The temple's orientation and relationship to the surrounding landscape have been studied for possible astronomical alignments, though conclusions remain measured, emphasizing that any such correspondences would have functioned within a broader symbolic framework, rather than as precise observatories. Environmental evidence suggests that during the period of temple construction, the islands supported a stable agricultural population, cultivating crops and raising livestock on limited land, making the allocation of labour to monument building a significant social choice rather than a surplus-driven inevitability. This choice raises questions about motivation. What ideas or practices were compelling enough to justify such sustained effort, and how were they maintained across centuries without apparent coercive hierarchy? Skeletal remains from Maltese Neolithic contexts show relatively uniform health and diet, hinting at a society that, while capable of monumentality, did not exhibit extreme inequality, complicating assumptions that large-scale construction requires rigid social stratification. At the same time, the temples themselves impose order through architecture, channeling movement, restricting access, and creating zones of visibility and concealment, suggesting that authority may have been exercised situationally through ritual roles rather than permanent political office. Contradictions become more pronounced when considering the eventual fate of the Ggantija temples and their counterparts across the islands. After centuries of use, the entire temple building culture came to an end around 2500 BCE, followed by a period of apparent population decline or transformation whose causes remain debated. Environmental degradation, resource depletion, climatic stress or social change have all been proposed, yet none fully account for the abrupt cessation of a tradition that had been maintained with remarkable consistency. The temples were not violently destroyed, but gradually fell into disuse, their stones later incorporated into agricultural walls or left to weather in place, preserving their outlines while erasing the practices that once animated them. This quiet abandonment reinforces the sense that monumentality in the Neolithic was not necessarily aimed at permanence in the modern sense, but at fulfilling roles within a living system that could, under changed conditions, be set aside. The survival of Ggantija into the present owes as much to the durability of stone and the relative isolation of Gozo as to any intention of legacy on the part of its builders. Today, the temples stand as evidence of an early architectural confidence, one that did not rely on vertical dominance or defensive enclosure, but on mass, curvature, and repetition to create meaning. They suggest a worldview in which stone was not merely a material, but a medium through which relationships between people, land, and cycles of life were negotiated. As with other early monumental sites, the temptation to see Ggantija as an isolated marvel gives way, on closer inspection, to its role within a broader coherent tradition, one that flourished quietly and then disappeared, leaving behind structures that are at once explicit in form and opaque in purpose. The temples do not yield a single explanation, but preserve a set of architectural decisions that continue to invite attention. Their massive stones holding questions rather than answers, and reminding us that some of the oldest buildings in the world were not built to dominate landscapes indefinitely, but to serve shared meanings whose full contours have slipped just beyond recovery. Dholavira. On the arid island of Kadir, set within the salt flats of the Rann of Kutch in western India, the ruins of Dholavira stretch across a gently rising plateau, their stone walls and reservoirs emerging slowly from a landscape defined by extremes, where seasonal monsoons bring brief abundance and long months of dryness test the limits of human planning. And it is within this demanding environment that one of the most carefully organized cities of the Indus Valley civilization took shape around 3000 BCE. Unlike earlier Neolithic settlements rooted primarily in subsistence and ritual, Dholavira belongs to a mature urban tradition, contemporaneous with Mohenjo Daro and Harappa, yet it distinguishes itself through its emphasis on water management, spatial order, and monumental restraint, rather than dense habitation or vertical display. The city is laid out with striking clarity, divided into distinct zones: the citadel, the middle town, and the lower town, each enclosed by massive stone walls built from locally quarried sandstone, a material choice that sets Dholavira apart from the predominantly brick-built cities elsewhere in the Indus world. This tripartite plan suggests a sophisticated understanding of urban hierarchy and function. Yet the absence of palaces, ostentatious tombs, or overt symbols of kingship complicates assumptions about centralized power, pointing instead toward governance embedded in civic organization rather than personal rule. The streets are broad and carefully aligned, intersecting at right angles, while gateways and bastions control movement between zones, creating a city that feels regulated without appearing oppressive. Most striking, however, is Dholavira's system of water reservoirs, a network of large, stone-lined tanks integrated directly into the urban fabric, designed to capture and store rainwater and runoff from nearby seasonal streams, ensuring survival in a region where rivers could vanish for months at a time. These reservoirs were not peripheral utilities but central features, some flanking the city walls, others positioned near public spaces, their scale and permanence indicating that water was both a practical necessity and a structuring principle of civic life. The engineering behind these systems reflects careful observation of terrain and hydrology, with channels, sluices and embankments guiding water efficiently while minimizing loss, all achieved without metal tools or modern surveying instruments. Residential architecture within the city varies in size and complexity, but adheres to consistent construction standards, suggesting regulated building practices and shared expectations rather than ad hoc growth. Artifacts recovered from the site, beads, seals, ceramics and weights, placed Dholavira firmly within the wider Indus trade network, connected to distant regions through exchange routes that moved goods and ideas across the subcontinent and beyond. Among the most distinctive finds is a large stone inscription composed of Indus script symbols set into a gateway, its scale and placement implying public visibility and shared recognition, even if its precise meaning remains undeciphered. This silent sign stands as a reminder that literacy, administration and identity were already deeply entwined here, though the content of that communication remains closed to modern interpretation. Environmental studies suggest that Dholavira experienced multiple phases of occupation, abandonment and reoccupation, closely tied to climatic fluctuations that altered rainfall patterns and water availability. These shifts required adaptation rather than collapse, and the archaeological record shows modifications to reservoirs and urban layout over time, indicating a capacity for long-term planning and resilience. Yet contradictions persist. Despite its careful design and apparent prosperity, Dholavira was eventually abandoned around 1900 BCE, part of the broader transformation that affected the entire Indus Valley civilization, a process marked more by decentralization and migration than by sudden destruction. The city's decline appears gradual, with no clear evidence of invasion or catastrophic failure, suggesting that environmental stress, changing trade routes, or evolving social preferences may have rendered large urban centres less viable or desirable. The precision of Dholavira's planning invites speculation about authority and coordination, but the uniformity of material culture and the lack of monumental royal imagery argue against a highly stratified society, reinforcing the idea that Indus cities operated through collective norms, standardized systems, and shared civic priorities rather than overt displays of power. In this sense, Dholavira represents a different model of early urbanism, one where order is achieved through infrastructure and regulation rather than spectacle. Its wide streets, open spaces, and emphasis on water management create an impression of deliberation and foresight, as though the city was designed not just to exist, but to endure within known environmental limits. And yet, like so many ancient sites, its endurance was finite, shaped by forces beyond architectural control. Today, the ruins lie exposed beneath a vast sky, their stone outlines tracing decisions made thousands of years ago by people who understood their environment intimately and built accordingly. Dholavira does not overwhelm with scale in the manner of later imperial capitals, but it impresses through coherence, through the sense that every wall, channel and reservoir participates in a larger logic that prioritized balance over dominance. It stands as evidence that some of the world's oldest cities were not experiments in excess, but in restraint, carefully calibrating human ambition to landscape and climate. The silence of its undeciphered script and the stillness of its empty reservoirs preserve an unresolved tension between clarity of form and opacity of meaning, leaving Dholavira as a measured, disciplined presence in the archaeological record, one that reveals how early urban societies could be both highly organised and fundamentally elusive, their principles legible in stone, even as their intentions remain just out of reach. Mohenjo Daro. Rising from the floodplain of the Indus River in what is now Sindh, Pakistan, Mohenjo Daro unfolds as a carefully ordered expanse of baked brick, its low walls and straight streets revealing themselves gradually through excavation, and, in doing so, presenting one of the clearest expressions of early urban planning in the ancient world, established around 2600 BCE, and occupied for several centuries at the height of the Indus Valley civilization. Unlike cities that announce power through towering monuments or royal iconography, Mohenjo Daro communicates its priorities through consistency and infrastructure. Its scale impressive not because of singular structures, but because of the repetition of standardized forms across a vast area. The city is divided into two primary mounds, commonly described as the citadel and the lower town, though these terms reflect modern interpretive frameworks rather than explicit evidence of political hierarchy. The citadel, elevated on a massive brick platform, contains some of the most distinctive structures, including the Great Bath, granaries and assembly spaces, while the lower town extends outward in a grid of residential blocks organised along straight, intersecting streets that suggest careful advanced planning rather than organic growth. The bricks themselves conform to a standardised ratio, reused and replaced over generations, indicating regulated production and shared technical norms across the Indus world. Water management emerges as a central theme, echoing but also expanding upon what is seen at Dholavira, with hundreds of wells distributed throughout the city, providing reliable access to clean water for households and public use, and an extensive system of covered drains running beneath the streets, sloped and lined to carry wastewater away efficiently. These drains were accessible through removable bricks, allowing for maintenance, a detail that speaks to an ongoing commitment to civic order rather than a one-time construction effort. The Great Bath, a large waterproofed tank lined with bitumen and surrounded by steps and rooms, occupies a prominent position on the citadel and has long been interpreted as a space for ritual purification or communal ceremony, though its exact function remains uncertain. What is clear is that it required careful engineering and regular upkeep, reinforcing the impression that collective practices, whether practical or symbolic, were central to urban life. Residential architecture varies in size, but most houses include private wells and bathing areas connected to the drainage system, suggesting a cultural emphasis on cleanliness and routine maintenance that permeated daily existence. Artifacts recovered from Mohenjo Daro, seals carved with animal motifs and Indus script, standardized weights, tools and ornaments, situate the city within a vast network of trade and communication that extended across the subcontinent and into Mesopotamia. Yet, as with Dholavira, the absence of overt markers of kingship or monumental temples complicates attempts to identify the mechanisms of authority that coordinated such large-scale urban order. Social stratification is present but restrained, inferred from differences in house size and location rather than from elite tombs or palaces, suggesting a society where status may have been expressed through access and responsibility rather than display. Over time, Mohenjo Daro underwent multiple phases of rebuilding, often in response to flooding, as the Indus River shifted its course and deposited layers of silt that required the city to raise street levels and reconstruct structures. This pattern of adaptation indicates resilience, but also reveals a long-term tension between human settlement and a dynamic riverine environment. Contradictions emerge in the city's decline around 1900 BCE, part of the broader transformation of the Indus Valley civilization, as evidence points to gradual abandonment rather than violent destruction. Skeletons found in earlier excavations were once taken as signs of sudden catastrophe, but later analysis has challenged these interpretations, emphasizing the lack of clear trauma patterns or widespread destruction layers. Instead, changing climate conditions, alterations in river systems, and shifts in trade networks are now seen as more plausible contributors to the city's depopulation, leading residents to disperse into smaller settlements rather than remain in large urban centres. This quiet unravelling complicates narratives of collapse, replacing them with a slower reconfiguration of social and economic life. Mohenjo Daro's uniformity, once viewed as evidence of centralised control, can also be read as the outcome of shared cultural values and cooperative governance where adherence to common standards enabled large populations to coexist with minimal overt coercion. The undeciphered Indus script continues to limit understanding of the city's political and religious structures, preserving a gap between material clarity and interpretive uncertainty. What remains visible, however, is a sustained commitment to urban livability, where access to water, waste removal, and orderly space were treated as collective concerns rather than privileges. In this sense, Mohenjo Daro represents a mature phase in the long experiment of city building, one that prioritized function and balance over spectacle, and in doing so, achieved a form of monumentality distributed across everyday infrastructure. The ruins today, fragile and eroding under exposure, retain an austere coherence, their straight lines and repeated forms still legible despite centuries of abandonment. They invite a reassessment of what constitutes architectural achievement, suggesting that some of the oldest cities expressed their ambitions not through singular wonders, but through systems that quietly shaped daily life. Mohenjo Daro does not offer dramatic ruins or clear narratives of rise and fall, but it preserves a disciplined vision of urban order whose underlying principles remain intelligible even as the social meanings that sustained them have receded, leaving behind a city that feels at once complete in form and unresolved in purpose, a testament to an early civilization whose achievements endure in brick, water and silence. Pyramid of Djoser. On the desert plateau of Saqqara, just south of the later pyramids of Giza, the Pyramid of Djoser rises in stepped layers above a field of sand and stone, its silhouette immediately distinct from the smooth-sided monuments that would follow, and in its form, preserving the moment when Egyptian architecture crossed a decisive threshold, moving from earth and timber into enduring stone around the early 27th century BCE. At first glance, the structure appears almost experimental, as if caught midway through an idea not yet fully resolved, and in many ways it is exactly that. The earliest large-scale stone monument in Egypt, conceived not as a single act of construction but as a process of revision and expansion that unfolded over time. What began as a traditional rectangular mastaba, a flat-roofed tomb built of stone rather than mud brick, was repeatedly enlarged, first laterally and then vertically, until it assumed its final six-tiered form, each layer receding slightly from the one below, creating a monumental staircase rising toward the sky. This gradual transformation is still legible in the masonry itself, where changes in orientation and technique reveal decisions made mid-construction, offering a rare architectural record of innovation unfolding in real time. The pyramid was built as the funerary monument of King Djoser of the Third Dynasty, but its significance extends well beyond an individual reign, as it marks the point at which royal burial architecture became inseparable from cosmic symbolism, permanence, and the visual assertion of order. Surrounding the pyramid is a vast enclosed complex, covering more than 15 hectares and bounded by a finely carved limestone wall punctuated with false doors, creating the illusion of accessibility while carefully controlling movement and visibility. Within this enclosure lies a carefully choreographed landscape of courtyards, shrines, and symbolic structures, many of them solid and non-functional, built to represent ritual spaces rather than serve practical use, suggesting that architecture here was intended to operate on a conceptual level as much as a physical one. The southern court, the Hebsed court, and the series of chapels aligned along the enclosure walls reflect ceremonies associated with royal renewal, embedding the king's continued authority into the spatial logic of the complex long after death. Beneath the pyramid itself, an extensive network of subterranean corridors and chambers extends deep into the bedrock, lined in places with blue faience tiles arranged to imitate woven reed mats, a deliberate reference to earlier, perishable architecture now translated into stone and ceramic, preserving familiar forms while redefining their material permanence. This tension between continuity and transformation runs throughout the monument, grounding its innovation in recognizable tradition rather than abrupt departure. The scale and precision of the complex imply a level of centralized organization unprecedented in earlier Egyptian building, with quarrying, transport, labor coordination, and design oversight operating at a national scale, and later tradition credits the architect Imhotep with overseeing this achievement, elevating him in memory as a rare named figure in early architectural history, though the extent of his role remains filtered through later reverence. What is clear is that the step pyramid represents not only a technical advance, but a conceptual one, articulating a vision of kingship that extended beyond death and demanded architectural expression equal to its cosmic claims. Yet contradictions emerge upon closer examination, particularly in the pyramid's stepped form, which does not yet resolve into the smooth, unified geometry that later pyramids would achieve. The structure feels additive rather than singular, its mass assembled through accretion rather than executed from a single fixed plan, and this quality lends it an almost provisional character, as though it captures a moment of exploration rather than final mastery. The surrounding complex, too, contains buildings that mimic earlier materials and forms without serving their original functions, blurring the boundary between representation and utility in ways that raise questions about how architecture was understood by those who built and used it. While later pyramids would refine and simplify royal funerary architecture, stripping away some of this symbolic abundance, Djoser's complex remains expansive and narrative, its spaces encoding ritual movement and mythic time rather than mere burial. The choice to build entirely in stone was itself a statement, not only of durability, but of ideological intent, transforming architecture into an instrument of eternal order aligned. With Maat, the Egyptian concept of balance and cosmic stability. At the same time, the pyramid's endurance owes as much to its experimental redundancy as to its ambition. Its thick masonry and stepped profile distributed weight effectively, allowing it to survive millennia of erosion and seismic stress that might have compromised a more refined form. Over time, as later dynasties perfected pyramid construction, the step pyramid became both a prototype and an anomaly, revered but not replicated, its lessons absorbed and then surpassed. The surrounding necropolis at Saqqara continued to develop for centuries, incorporating mastabas, pyramids, and later tombs that echoed and responded to Djoser's monument, situating it within a living landscape rather than isolating it as a singular wonder. Yet despite its integration into a broader tradition, the step pyramid retains a distinct presence, one that feels transitional rather than definitive, capturing the moment when architecture first assumed the burden of eternity on behalf of political power. The structure does not merely mark a king's burial. It records a shift in how humans imagined the relationship between material, authority, and time, revealing an early confidence that stone could anchor ideology across generations. Standing today amid the Saqqara Plateau, weathered but unmistakable, the Pyramid of Djoser preserves the traces of decisions made at the edge of architectural possibility, its layered form holding both the certainty of royal ambition and the uncertainty of invention, offering a reminder that even the most enduring monuments began as questions built in stone, whose answers were refined only gradually and never entirely closed. Great Pyramid of Giza. On the limestone plateau at Giza, where the desert rises gently above the Nile floodplain, the Great Pyramid stands with a clarity of form that feels almost inevitable, as though its geometry were less designed than discovered. And yet its construction around 2600 BCE required an unprecedented convergence of planning, labour and material control, elevating it from royal tomb to a defining statement of early monumental architecture. Built for the 4th dynasty King Khufu, the pyramid was originally encased in fine Tura limestone, its sides smooth and reflective, rising to a height of roughly 146 metres, and aligned with remarkable precision to the cardinal points, a level of accuracy that continues to draw careful measurement rather than wonder alone. Unlike the experimental accretion of Djoser's step pyramid, the Great Pyramid presents itself as a single unified concept, executed with consistency from base to apex. Its mass, composed of an estimated 2.3 million stone blocks, arranged in horizontal courses that diminish in size as they ascend. This visual simplicity conceals an interior complexity, where passages, chambers, and relieving spaces are carefully embedded within the structure, balancing symbolic intent with structural necessity. The entrance, set high on the northern face, leads through a descending corridor to subterranean chambers, while an ascending passage branches toward the so-called Queen's Chamber and the Grand Gallery, a tall corbelled space whose proportions and precision suggest not ornament but controlled tension, culminating in the King's Chamber, constructed of massive granite blocks and capped by a series of relieving chambers designed to distribute the immense weight above. These internal features reveal a deep understanding of stone behaviour and load management, achieved without iron tools or modern mathematics, yet grounded in empirical knowledge refined through earlier projects. The pyramid was part of a larger funerary complex that included temples, causeways, subsidiary pyramids, and a planned workers' settlement, situating it within a carefully organised landscape rather than as an isolated object. Archaeological evidence from nearby sites indicates that its builders were not enslaved labourers, but a rotating workforce supported by state provisioning, housed, fed and managed as part of a seasonal system tied to the Nile's inundation, reinforcing the interpretation of pyramid building as a national project embedded in agricultural rhythms and administrative capability. The sheer scale of coordination required, quarrying stone from local and distant sources, transporting blocks across prepared routes, and maintaining consistent quality, speaks to a highly centralised state apparatus, yet one that expressed its power through architectural permanence rather than overt militarisation. The pyramid's form embodies the Egyptian conception of kingship as a stabilizing axis between earth and sky, its sloping sides possibly referencing the primeval mound or the rays of the sun, while its internal orientation and shafts have been studied for astronomical significance, though interpretations remain measured and grounded in material evidence rather than speculation. Over time, the Great Pyramid accumulated layers of meaning beyond its original funerary purpose, serving as a reference point for later monuments, a source of myth and measurement for classical authors, and a canvas for modern projection. Yet, even stripped of these later narratives, its original context reveals a structure designed to endure, not merely physically but ideologically, asserting a vision of order, continuity, and divine kingship intended to outlast individual memory. Contradictions arise when considering the pyramid's interior austerity compared to its external perfection, as the absence of elaborate decoration within the burial chamber contrasts sharply with the immense effort invested in the overall form, suggesting that the monument's primary audience was not human visitors but the cosmos itself, or the perpetuation of abstract principles rather than narrative display. The pyramid's eventual fate also complicates notions of permanence, as its casing stones were quarried away in later periods, its temples dismantled, and its original context partially erased, leaving behind a core that is both resilient and altered. This gradual stripping underscores that monumentality does not guarantee preservation of intent, only of presence. Despite this, the Great Pyramid's geometry remains legible, its proportions continuing to invite analysis, not because they conceal secret knowledge, but because they exemplify an early mastery of scale and precision achieved through cumulative expertise rather than sudden revelation. The pyramid's relationship to its neighbouring monuments on the Giza plateau further reinforces its role as part of an evolving architectural dialogue, where subsequent pyramids refined, adapted, or deliberately departed from Khufu's example, responding to both its achievements and its constraints. In this sense, the Great Pyramid is not an isolated pinnacle, but a central chapter in a longer narrative of experimentation, ambition, and consolidation within Egyptian statecraft. Its enduring presence has shaped how monumentality itself is understood, often obscuring the quieter, more provisional structures that preceded it, yet it remains grounded in the same processes of trial, adaptation, and social organization that define earlier sites. Standing today against the shifting light of the desert, the Great Pyramid retains an air of resolution, as though the questions posed by earlier experiments in stone had found a temporary answer here, even as later generations would reinterpret, dismantle, and repurpose its legacy. It endures not as a riddle to be solved, but as a measure against which human capacity for coordinated effort and architectural clarity has been assessed ever since, its silence less an invitation to speculation than a reminder of how fully material form can absorb and transmit intention across vast spans of time. Karnak Temple Complex. On the east bank of the Nile, at Thebes, modern Luxor, the Karnak Temple Complex spreads outward in layers rather than rising toward a single peak, its vastness revealed not through one defining silhouette, but through accumulation, as successive generations of builders added courts, pylons, halls, and sanctuaries over nearly 2 millennia, transforming a modest Middle Kingdom shrine into the largest religious complex of the ancient world. Unlike the Great Pyramid, which presents a resolved architectural statement bound to a single reign, Karnak remains perpetually unfinished, its identity shaped by continuity rather than closure, and it is this open-ended growth that defines its character. Dedicated primarily to the god Amun, later Amun-Ra, Karnak functioned as the ritual and ideological heart of New Kingdom Egypt, a place where divine authority, royal legitimacy, and state ritual converged in stone. The complex is oriented along a central axis aligned with the Nile and the rising sun. Yet this axis is repeatedly extended, redirected, and monumentalized as new pylons were constructed at its western approach, each gateway marking not an entrance in the modern sense, but a temporal boundary, a point at which a king inserted his reign into an already ancient landscape. Passing through these pylons leads into a sequence of open courts and enclosed halls that alternately compress and release movement, controlling sightlines and sound, and gradually transitioning from the profane to the sacred. The Great Hypostyle Hall, built primarily under Seti I and Rameses II, exemplifies this spatial strategy. Its forest of 134 massive columns rising in dense ranks, their capitals carved in papyrus and lotus forms that evoke the primeval marsh, transforming architecture into a symbolic environment rather than a mere enclosure. Light enters through clear story windows, illuminating reliefs that depict ritual processions, offerings, and royal victories, embedding narrative and authority directly into the fabric of the building. Construction techniques at Karnak range from finely dressed sandstone blocks to colossal monoliths, reflecting both technological capability and the logistical reach of the state, which quarried stone from distant sites and transported obelisks weighing hundreds of tons along the Nile. These obelisks, erected by rulers such as Hatshepsut and Thutmose I, served not only as markers of devotion, but as vertical signatures inscribing individual reigns into the sacred landscape, while reinforcing the solar associations of Amun-Ra. Unlike earlier monuments that focused on funerary permanence, Karnak was a living temple, maintained, expanded and modified through daily ritual and seasonal festivals, most notably the Opet festival, during which divine statues were carried along the processional avenue connecting Karnak to Luxor Temple. This repeated movement animated the architecture, making the complex a stage for cyclical renewal rather than a static monument. Administrative buildings, storage, magazines, and workshops integrated into the precinct reveal that Karnak was also an economic centre, managing land, labour, and resources on a scale comparable to that of royal estates. Yet even as the temple accumulated wealth and influence, its architecture remained governed by tradition, adhering to established forms, while allowing variation in scale and ornament, creating a balance between innovation and continuity. Contradictions emerge in the very success of this model, as the temple's expansion reflects not only religious devotion but political competition, with rulers compelled to build larger pylons or erect taller obelisks than their predecessors, transforming sacred architecture into a medium of dynastic rivalry. At the same time, the layering of construction sometimes obscured or dismantled earlier phases, burying past sanctuaries within new walls and complicating modern attempts to reconstruct the site's chronological development. The eventual decline of Karnak mirrors broader shifts in Egyptian history, as changes in religious practice, political fragmentation, and later foreign rule altered the temple's role, leading to periods of neglect, reuse, and spoliation. Stone was quarried from its walls for later buildings. Reliefs were defaced or recarved to suit new ideologies. And yet the sheer scale of the complex ensured that much survived, preserving a record of ambition that no single period could fully control. In contrast to the concentrated perfection of the Great Pyramid, Karnak offers a different vision of monumentality, one rooted in duration rather than completion, where meaning accrued through repetition and maintenance rather than final form. Its architecture does not resolve into a single message, but holds multiple, sometimes competing, statements layered one upon another, reflecting a society that understood power as something to be continually renewed rather than once established. Walking through Karnak today, the sense is less of encountering an ancient blueprint than of moving through a historical process made visible, where each wall and column marks a decision made in response to inherited structures and expectations. The complex resists reduction to a single narrative, its scale overwhelming not through size alone, but through temporal depth, compressing centuries of belief, labour, and authority into a single sprawling precinct. Karnak stands as a reminder that some of the world's oldest buildings were not conceived as finished works, but as frameworks for ongoing engagement, their architecture designed to absorb change while maintaining continuity. In this way, it preserves a different kind of mystery, not in unanswered questions about how it was built, but in how it sustained relevance across generations, adapting to shifting political and religious realities, without ever fully relinquishing its central role, leaving behind a built record of belief in motion rather than belief fixed in stone. Cerro Sechin. At the edge of the Casma Valley on Peru's north-central coast, where the Andean foothills descend toward a dry river plain shaped by seasonal flows, the low stone platform of Cerro Sechin rises with a restraint that initially conceals its significance. Its form neither towering nor expansive, yet its surfaces carry one of the most unsettling visual records left by an early monumental society dating to roughly 1800 BCE, at a time when complex cultures were emerging independently across the Americas. From a distance, the structure appears straightforward, a rectangular stone enclosure built atop a raised platform, its walls formed from carefully fitted blocks of granite and basalt, arranged with an economy of form that suggests deliberation rather than ornament. It is only upon closer approach that the carved reliefs lining these walls begin to assert themselves, transforming the site from an architectural curiosity into a sustained visual statement, unlike anything else from its period. The stones depict fragmented human bodies, severed heads, exposed ribs, dismembered limbs, and figures wielding weapons, rendered with a clarity that avoids embellishment, and instead emphasizes physical consequence, creating a procession of images that encircle the structure in a continuous band. These carvings are not hidden within an interior sanctuary, but placed deliberately on the exterior walls, making them visible to anyone approaching or moving around the building, and situating violence, or at least its representation, as part of the site's outward-facing identity. Cerro Sechin belongs to the pre-ceramic or early ceramic traditions of the Andes, predating the rise of later states such as Chavin, and its construction reflects an early stage of monumentality rooted in stoneworking and spatial control rather than urban density. The platform and enclosure suggest a ceremonial or administrative function rather than domestic use, with no evidence of residential occupation within the structure itself. Excavations have revealed earlier building phases beneath the visible monument, indicating that the site evolved over time, with successive renovations and expansions that maintained the core layout while modifying its scale and presentation. This continuity suggests that the meanings embedded in the architecture were sustained across generations, even as social conditions may have shifted. The reliefs themselves have generated careful debate, as their imagery resists simple categorization as mythological, narrative, or purely symbolic. Some interpretations view the carvings as representations of defeated enemies, ritual sacrifice, or the aftermath of conflict, while others emphasize their potential role as warnings, legitimizing authority through the visible consequences of transgression. Importantly, there is no clear evidence of large-scale warfare in the region at this early date, complicating readings that assume organized armies or territorial conquest. Instead, the images may reflect episodic conflict, ritualized violence, or a symbolic vocabulary through which power was articulated in the absence of written law. The architectural setting reinforces this ambiguity, as the reliefs are not accompanied by inscriptions or explanatory markers, leaving their interpretation dependent on context and comparison rather than direct testimony. The Casma Valley itself supported early irrigation agriculture, allowing for surplus production and population concentration, and Cerro Sechin appears within a broader landscape of ceremonial centres that together suggest regional coordination rather than isolated experimentation. Yet, Cerro Sechin stands apart in tone, its visual programme markedly more austere and corporeal than that of neighbouring sites, which often emphasise abstract forms or later stylised iconography. This divergence raises questions about social organisation and belief, and whether Cerro Sechin represents a localised expression of authority or an early phase in a longer ideological trajectory that would later be transformed. The building's layout, with its controlled entrances and enclosed space, implies regulated access, suggesting that participation in whatever activities occurred here was selective, mediated by roles or status rather than open to all. At the same time, the exterior placement of the reliefs indicates that their message was meant to be broadly legible, even if its meaning was not universally shared. Contradictions deepen when considering the site's eventual abandonment. Cerro Sechin does not show signs of violent destruction, nor does it appear to have been erased by later construction, but rather gradually fell out of use, its stones left in place as new centres emerged elsewhere in the valley. This quiet cessation complicates interpretations that emphasize dominance or coercion, suggesting instead that the social logic sustaining the site lost relevance as conditions changed. Over time, wind and sediment partially buried the platform, preserving the carvings while muting their impact until excavation re-exposed them in the 20th century. Today, Cerro Sechin challenges assumptions that early monumentality was primarily celebratory or cosmological, offering instead an architecture that confronts the body directly, using stone to fix images of vulnerability and control into the landscape. Yet even here, caution tempers interpretation, as the reliefs may encode meanings now irretrievable, their apparent violence serving functions that extended beyond intimidation or record. The absence of elite tombs, palaces, or clear hierarchies at the site leaves open the possibility that authority was situational, enacted through ceremony rather than permanent rule. In this sense, Cerro Sechin occupies a distinctive position in the global record of early architecture, demonstrating that the impulse to build enduring structures could also carry messages of discipline, consequence, and social boundary without relying on kingship or empire. Its walls do not offer resolution or reassurance, but they do preserve a moment when architecture became a medium for confronting the realities of power and the human body, fixing them into stone without explanation. As with many of the world's oldest buildings, Cerro Sechin remains legible in form, yet elusive in intent, its imagery stark, but its meaning incomplete, inviting continued examination while resisting closure, and reminding us that early monumental spaces were not always places of comfort or harmony, but could also serve as arenas where emerging societies negotiated authority, memory, and the costs of order, in ways that remain unsettling precisely because they are so carefully rendered and so sparingly explained. Masada. Rising abruptly from the Judean desert near the western shore of the Dead Sea, Masada occupies a flattened limestone plateau whose sheer cliffs fall away on all sides, creating a naturally bounded landscape that appears at once isolated and deliberate, a place defined as much by its topography as by the architecture laid upon it. The site's earliest fortifications likely date to the Hasmonean period in the late 2nd century BCE, but it was under Herod the Great, in the closing decades of the 1st century BCE, that Masada assumed the form most visible today, transformed into a fortified palace complex that combined defensive pragmatism with conspicuous refinement. Herod's builders enclosed the plateau with a casemate wall punctuated by towers, adapting the perimeter to the irregular contours of the rock, rather than imposing strict geometry. And within this boundary arranged storehouses, barracks, administrative buildings, and a series of palaces that cascade down the northern face in terraces, their colonnades and frescoed walls oriented toward views of the desert and the Dead Sea beyond. The contrast between the harsh surrounding environment and the architectural comfort of these spaces is striking, revealing a vision of power that sought not only security, but control over environment and experience, turning isolation into an asset rather than a liability. Central to this control was water, the most fragile resource in the desert, and Masada's system of cisterns and channels represents one of its most impressive achievements, capturing flash floods from surrounding wadis and storing them in massive rock-cut reservoirs capable of sustaining a large population through prolonged dry periods. This infrastructure was not ornamental, but foundational, making habitation on the plateau viable and reinforcing the site's role as a refuge as well as a residence. After Herod's death, Masada passed through periods of reduced significance until the first Jewish revolt against Roman rule in the 1st century CE, when it was occupied by a group of Jewish rebels, often identified with the Sicarii, who adapted Herod's complex to new circumstances without substantially altering its core layout. Archaeological remains from this phase suggest reuse rather than reinvention, with domestic activity concentrated in existing buildings and limited new construction, indicating a pragmatic relationship to inherited architecture. The Roman response to this occupation is preserved in the landscape surrounding the plateau, where camps, walls, and the great siege ramp remain visible, forming a stark counterpoint to the enclosed world above. These features speak to the logistical capacity of the Roman army and its methodical approach to siege warfare, yet they also frame Masada as part of a broader imperial system rather than an isolated episode. Within the plateau itself, the material record from the final occupation is fragmentary and open to interpretation, and while later narratives emphasize dramatic resolution, the archaeological evidence invites a more measured reading, focused on adaptation, endurance, and the limits imposed by geography and power. The buildings of Masada, stripped of later symbolism, reveal a site shaped by layered intentions, a royal retreat, a logistical stronghold, and eventually a refuge whose meaning shifted with its occupants. Contradictions emerge when considering the site's dual identity, as the luxury of Herodian palaces coexists uneasily with the image of austere resistance often associated with its final phase, reminding us that architecture outlasts ideology and can be repurposed without shedding its origins. The Roman destruction of the site did not erase it entirely. Instead, Masada entered a long period of abandonment, its structures preserved by aridity and isolation rather than continuous use. Over centuries, the plateau became a ruin defined by exposure, its walls eroding slowly, its cisterns filling with sediment, until modern excavation reassembled its narrative from stone, pottery, and the careful mapping of space. In this process, Masada has often been drawn into broader discussions of identity and memory, yet the architecture itself resists reduction to a single story, offering instead a record of strategic thinking, environmental adaptation, and architectural inheritance. The plateau's enclosure creates a sense of completeness, yet its openness to the sky and desert emphasizes vulnerability, underscoring that even the most carefully planned strongholds are contingent on forces beyond their control. Seen within the longer arc of ancient building, Masada marks a shift from the monumental expressions of divine or royal eternity toward architecture defined by logistics, surveillance, and endurance, where walls and water systems mattered as much as symbolism. It also illustrates how sites acquire meaning after their functional life has ended, their ruins becoming repositories for later interpretation. Standing today above the Dead Sea, the remains of Masada hold together refinement and austerity, ambition and constraint, preserving a built environment that was never static, but continually renegotiated by those who occupied it. Its power lies not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of decisions shaped by landscape, politics, and survival, leaving behind a place that feels resolved in form, yet open in meaning. A reminder that some of the world's oldest and most influential structures derive their lasting presence not from scale alone, but from the tension between human intention and the environments that ultimately define its limits. Colosseum. In the center of Rome, where layers of history compress tightly against one another, the Colosseum rises as a hollowed mass of travertine and concrete, its repeating arches forming a rhythmic facade that feels both open and imposing, a structure whose familiarity often obscures the specificity of its origins and purpose. Begun around 72 CE under the Emperor Vespasian, and completed less than a decade later by his successors as part of a deliberate reconfiguration of urban space and imperial identity. Built on land once occupied by Nero's private lake, the amphitheatre represented a reversal of excess, reclaiming territory from imperial seclusion and returning it, at least symbolically, to public use, though this gesture was carefully managed and framed through architecture rather than spontaneity. The Colosseum's elliptical form, measuring nearly 190 metres along its major axis, was engineered to accommodate tens of thousands of spectators, its tiered seating arranged according to social hierarchy, ensuring that status was embedded directly into the spatial experience of attendance. Beneath this ordered surface lay a complex substructure, the hypogeum, a dense network of corridors, lifts, cages and machinery that supported the spectacles above, allowing animals, performers and scenery to appear with controlled timing, transforming the arena into a carefully regulated stage rather than a chaotic ground. The building's materials reflect the logistical reach of the Roman state. Travertine quarried from Tivoli, tough and brick-faced concrete forming the core, and metal clamps binding stone blocks together, all assembled through standardized techniques that prioritized efficiency and durability. Unlike earlier monumental buildings that sought to align themselves with divine order or funerary permanence, the Colosseum was explicitly functional, designed for repeated use, rapid circulation and crowd management, its numerous entrances and staircases allowing tens of thousands to enter and exit with remarkable speed. This emphasis on movement and control reflects a broader Roman approach to architecture as an instrument of administration, where form followed the needs of governance and social regulation as much as aesthetic ambition. The spectacles hosted within the arena, gladiatorial combats, animal hunts, executions and reenactments, have come to dominate popular memory of the Colosseum. Yet these events were only one aspect of a broader system in which public entertainment served to reinforce civic identity, imperial generosity and social order. The architecture itself played an active role in this process, framing visibility, directing attention, and separating participants from spectators, power from vulnerability. Inscriptions and decorative programs once adorned the structure, though much has been lost, reminding us that the Colosseum was not intended as a ruinous shell, but as a richly articulated environment whose surfaces communicated messages of authority and beneficence. Contradictions emerge when considering the amphitheatre's longevity, as its purpose was tied to practices that would eventually lose cultural and political support, leading to a gradual decline in use by late antiquity. As spectacles waned, the building was adapted to new functions, serving at various times as housing, workshops, fortifications, and a quarry for reusable stone, its material value outlasting its original social role. This process of reuse altered the structure profoundly, stripping away decorative elements and destabilizing sections, yet it also ensured survival, as the Colosseum remained embedded in the life of the city rather than abandoned outright. Earthquakes and weather further reshaped its form, collapsing portions of the outer ring and exposing the internal framework, transforming a once seamless envelope into the fractured monument visible today. Unlike the pyramids or temples that were designed to resist change through isolation and sanctity, the Colosseum endured precisely because it was adaptable, its architecture open to reinterpretation and appropriation across centuries. The building's meaning shifted repeatedly, from imperial venue to medieval stronghold, from Christian symbol to antiquarian curiosity, each phase layering new narratives onto its stones without fully erasing earlier ones. This accumulation complicates any singular interpretation, as the Colosseum embodies both the confidence of imperial Rome and the fragility of structures bound to specific social practices. Its scale and engineering continue to impress, Yet its hollow interior and eroded surfaces emphasize absence as much as presence, making the monument as much about what has vanished as what remains. In the broader arc of ancient architecture, the Colosseum represents a culmination of civic monumentality, where technical mastery and social organization converged to create a space capable of managing mass participation and spectacle on an unprecedented scale. At the same time, it marks a turning point, as few later societies would invest so heavily in buildings designed primarily for public entertainment, without accompanying sacred or funerary functions. The amphitheatre's clarity of purpose, once its strength, became a vulnerability as cultural priorities shifted, leaving behind a form that could be repurposed but not fully re-inhabited in its original sense. Standing today amid modern Rome, the Colosseum persists as a structure both resolved and unsettled, its arches framing the sky much as they once framed crowds and ceremonies, its endurance shaped less by immutable intention than by centuries of negotiation between use, neglect, and memory. It does not conceal mysteries of construction or lost knowledge, but it does preserve a quieter uncertainty about how architecture binds itself to the values of its time, and what remains when those values fade, leaving stone and concrete to carry forward a presence that is unmistakable, yet permanently detached from the world that gave it meaning. Temple of Garni. On a triangular promontory overlooking the Azat River Gorge in the Armenian highlands, the Temple of Garni stands with a composure that feels deliberate against its dramatic setting, its colonnaded silhouette framed by steep basalt cliffs and distant mountains, a solitary classical form situated far beyond the Mediterranean heartland, from which its architectural language emerged. Built in the 1st century CE, traditionally dated to the reign of King Tiridates, the first Garni occupies a cultural crossroads where local traditions, regional power and Roman influence intersected without fully subsuming one another. Unlike the sprawling accumulation of Karnak or the civic intensity of the Colosseum, Garni is compact, self-contained and resolutely singular, a peripteral temple constructed of precisely cut basalt blocks, laid without mortar, their stability achieved through careful carving and metal clamps rather than mass alone. The structure rests on a raised podium, accessed by a broad staircase, its Ionic columns supporting a triangular pediment whose proportions adhere closely to Greco-Roman norms, creating an immediate sense of familiarity that contrasts with the surrounding landscape and with earlier Armenian building traditions. This familiarity, however, is not imitation in the narrow sense, but adaptation, as the temple's materials, setting, and continued use distinguish it from its Mediterranean counterparts. The interior cella is relatively small and enclosed, suggesting that ritual focus lay less in congregational gathering and more in the presence of the deity housed within, often identified as Mir, a solar god associated with light, contract, and order, whose attributes resonated with both local belief and broader Indo-Iranian traditions. The choice to express such worship through a classical temple form reflects a period in which Armenian rulers negotiated visibility and legitimacy within a world shaped by Rome and Parthia, adopting external symbols without abandoning local autonomy. Archaeological context shows that Garni was part of a larger fortified complex, including palaces, bathhouses with mosaic floors, and defensive walls, indicating that the temple functioned within a royal and administrative landscape rather than as an isolated sanctuary. The bath complex, built in Roman style and decorated with geometric and figural mosaics, reinforces the sense that classical forms here were embedded in daily elite life as well as ceremonial practice. Yet Garni's survival into the present owes less to continuous use than to interruption, as Armenia's early adoption of Christianity in the 4th century CE led to the abandonment or destruction of many pagan temples. Garni stands as a rare exception, traditionally said to have been spared due to its integration into the royal residence, though definitive evidence for this narrative remains elusive. Its endurance was nevertheless precarious. In 1679, a powerful earthquake reduced the temple to ruins, scattering its blocks down the slope of the gorge, and for centuries it remained a collapsed monument, its classical clarity broken into fragments. The modern reconstruction of Garni in the 20th century, based on detailed documentation and the recovery of original stones, reassembled the temple through anastylosis, a process that restores form while raising questions about authenticity, continuity, and the role of modern interpretation in shaping ancient presence. This act of rebuilding introduces a subtle contradiction. As the temple visible today is both ancient and modern, its proportions faithful, yet its standing form dependent on contemporary decisions about completeness and coherence. Despite this, Garni retains a powerful sense of place, its columns aligning with the horizon, and its steps anchoring ritual movement in a landscape long associated with sacred geography. The surrounding gorge, known for its columnar basalt formations, sometimes called the Symphony of Stones, reinforces the dialogue between natural order and human geometry, making the temple feel less imposed upon the land than in conversation with it. In the broader arc of ancient architecture, Garni represents a late but significant moment when the monumental traditions of the ancient world had already matured and begun to transform, and when building in stone was no longer an experimental assertion but a deliberate statement of identity. It lacks the overwhelming scale of imperial centres and the raw novelty of early monuments, yet it carries a different weight, preserving the question of how architectural languages travel, adapt, and persist at cultural margins. The temple's clean lines and balanced proportions suggest confidence rather than excess, a choice to communicate stability and alignment with cosmic order rather than dominance or spectacle. At the same time, its isolated survival highlights the fragility of such statements, as shifts in belief and power rendered many similar structures obsolete or expendable. Garni's continued presence, reconstructed yet grounded in original material, preserves a moment when ancient Armenia articulated itself through stone in dialogue with the wider classical world, without dissolving into it. Standing above the gorge, the temple feels neither fully ancient nor entirely modern, neither wholly local nor entirely foreign, but suspended between these categories, its clarity of form offering no mystery of construction, yet inviting reflection on continuity, loss, and revival. It closes this sequence of the world's oldest surviving buildings, not with a sense of culmination, but with a quieter persistence, suggesting that architectural endurance is not only a matter of age or mass, but of context, adaptation, and the willingness of later generations to see value in preservation, even when original meanings have shifted. Garni remains a composed presence at the edge of antiquity, its columns holding space for a past that did not vanish entirely, but settled into the landscape, awaiting rediscovery and reassembly without ever fully surrendering its ambiguity.